Is an animator, and is going to talk about one of her projects and show a short film, which is about 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. We will dim the lights, and I will pass straight over.
Cool. Okay, I'm not sure if this is a blessing or a curse, because you're all sort of well-oiled, but possibly quite knackered as well. So I shall try to retain your interest and also keep it fairly short, because otherwise I will be like Cinderella, sort of turning into a pumpkin at 9 o'clock and have to leave. Okay, so my project, An Eye Full of Sound, was a short film that I made, a short animated documentary that I made in 2010. It was the culmination of a 5-year project that was Wellcome Trust funded, and it was about audiovisual synesthesia. Synesthesia, I'm sure many of you will know, is a brain trait that some of us possess, not me, sadly, but it's when one sense is stimulated, more than one sense reacts. So more than one sense responds. So it could be, I was working with audiovisual synesthetes, so those are people that if you played them sounds, they would see the sounds, but they would also see colours, shapes and textures that went with it. But they might also have other senses that were stimulated too, like, sort of touch, taste, or various different senses. So it's not just one two senses. It can be more than two. Synesthesia was first studied in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was very popular. It was kind of a very popular subject, but it went sort of seriously out of fashion for about 50 years, and it was only really kind of resuscitated after the interest in the 1960s in cognitive psychology, but also the advent of the fMRI scanner, which meant that you could look at the brain of someone who said they were synesthetic, and you could see they were synesthetic. So we have neural connectors in our brain, which, are pruned, is described, they're pruned off at birth. So there's a theory that all babies are synesthetic, all babies, which kind of makes sense, because babies need to assimilate as much information from as many places as possible and don't really have a use for putting them into boxes, like this is a smell or this is a sound. But then as the brain develops, those sort of neural connectors are pruned off, and so you have, definite areas where you process visual or where you process oral. But in some people, that pruning doesn't always take place, or only partially takes place. And so with an fMRI scanner, you can actually see inside the brain of somebody. You can see that when you play them a sound, the part of their brain that processes vision also lights up. And so it's kind of indexical. It's an indexical trace of the reality of that sort of situation. So. When I first started working with synesthesia, I had this idea of kind of like colour and sound. One of the most common forms of synesthesia is grapheme colour synesthesia. So that's when people have very specific colours that they associate with certain letters. And also coloured days of the week is also an extremely common form of synesthesia. So if you feel that each day of the week has a certain colour, then that means you're mildly synesthetic. And when I first started working this project, I told this to my husband, and he said, everybody has coloured days of the week. And I was like, oh, sausage, you're synesthetic. And he was like, no, I'm not. And it's kind of interesting, because for a long time they thought that synesthesia was more of a female trait than it was a male trait. And as it turns out, more recent research has shown that it's not more of a female trait. It's equally over both genders. But from my experience with my husband, I would say that men are more shy about coming forward, about seeing things or associating things. So that's kind of what, and so this was all, tied in with my idea. This is Tessa's Days of the Week, with a line down the middle, Saturday and Sunday are golden, as they are really to everybody. But then she'd done this for another project, she showed it to me, and this slide shows, you can see she is the figure standing there on the cusp of the 21st century. So she sees time, not just in colour, but she sees it physically to her body. And what I discovered was there are two forms of synesthesia. There's associative synesthesia, which is when you just feel like Tuesday's yellow, right? Tuesday just is, you kind of just feel it is, you just know it is, it just feels right in your head. But there's another form which is a projector synesthesia, which is where you actually project it outside of your body, and that's kind of a very strong form of synesthesia, but you actually see things outside of your body. I was working with one guy who was, again, an example of an embarrassed man. He was a scientist, actually, and he was kind of totally, his mum made him come and talk to me. She was like, my son's synesthetic. And I played him a note, and he said it was like a vibrating woolly blanket at waist level. And he just was kind of, he couldn't get his head around that that's what he knew to be the case, and yet it was kind of, he had to describe it in that way. So synesthesia is now recognised as a documented brain trait that can give valuable, broader insight into how everybody's brains work. Although it was originally, if you look at the writing on this, if you look at the research, the early research that says this is incredibly rare, hardly anybody has it, it's really unusual. But now, actually, Jill Simner at the University of Edinburgh, she wrote an article in 2012 in the British Journal of Psychology describing 61 different variants of synesthesia. So you can have, like, I remember the researchers that work, we got very excited because he met someone who had vision touch synesthesia. So whatever they saw, they felt on their own body, which would be really awful if you're watching boxing, but kind of exciting if you're watching porn. There's also, I'm the head of the UK Synesthesia Association, James Wannerton. He has word taste synesthesia. So every time you speak to him, every word you say has got a different taste. And actually it's kind of interesting because the tastes that he has kind of seem to back up the idea that everybody is synesthetic at birth and then that you lose it. Because all the tastes he has are, he's an early 60s baby, so all the tastes that he has are kind of 60s kind of tastes. Things that people don't really use or taste anymore, like tin peas or evaporated milk or, I don't know, brandy snaps. The London Underground got him to do a map of the tube. They got him to do a tube map, but instead of the names, he's put all the tastes. So I grew up in brandy snap, which is hibonic. I was kind of pleased it wasn't, snot or earwax, because those are on his palate as well. Okay, so a key thing to know about synesthesia is that everybody, even if you have two people who have the same type of synesthesia, they will not experience it the same. They will experience it completely uniquely to them. So people can I've been to synesthesia conferences where there are kind of really eminent neuropsychologists talking, and then they'll do something like put a 2 on screen and it's in cerise. And they will get heckled by the audience. Who'll be like, that's wrong, it's wrong. Because they kind of have very strong synesthetes and they find it almost hard to look at that colour when they know it's the wrong colour for the number 2. So when I started working on these projects, I was playing people sounds and they were giving me kind of really different explanations of what it looked like. So it had a white middle to it, a tube shape made of air, and the background is the colour from the notes bleeding outwards. The lower note is crimson, it's a different person, like a 3D tartan, but all apart, with the threads crossing each other, hairy and coarse, like gardening twine. Okay, and another one, there's a clean shape of the note with a mist hovering around the end of it, which is the ghost of the old note. So that kind of threw me, how much kind of information there was. I thought it would be, it's blue, I don't know, it's a particular cerulean blue. But no, it's kind of really specific colours, textures. And the textures thing is what I was really surprised by. One woman ran to her bathroom to bring me an elasticated bandage so I could feel the exact texture of that particular sound to her. So there's kind of such specificity about the way they experience particular sounds that it becomes very interesting as someone who's kind of negotiating their experience and trying to put a representation of it onto the screen as an animator. So I kind of developed a methodology which was sort of rough for this project, to be honest. I just kind of make it up as I went along, but I was really interested in it. And since then I've done a PhD, which I've kind of tested this methodology on different types of brain traits, different perceptual states. So I've done a project with prosopagnosia, people with prosopagnosia, which is face blindness, and also with people with phantom limb syndrome. I'm not going to talk about those, but it was really interesting. It's a bit pervy to get excited when someone tells you they're brain damaged. You're like, oh, tell me more, and then you realise that's totally inappropriate. Okay. So so my interest is I'm an animator, and I've worked as a documentary animator, and animation used in a documentary sense is something that's kind of grown and it's reached a kind of critical mass until it's sort of become accepted within animation that animated documentary does exist. This is not accepted in broader sort of documentary circles, live action documentary, as we call it in the animated documentary world. So I was kind of really interested in why you should use, because there is a kind of like counterintuitive thing about using animation which is all made up about something which is documentary, which is the truth. So, or purports to be. And so I was kind of really interested to think about what it is that animation can bring, and something that animation has, is understood to do well is to evoke the internal, is to evoke the entirely subjective. We're talking about people who are projector synesthetes, so this is something they see outside of their body, and so if you try and kind of, represent that, you're showing something that is absolutely real to them, but is not real to anybody else, and it cannot possibly be. So that kind of dichotomy really interested me. So the part of the methodology I sort of worked with was we used Munsell colour charts. So here's lovely Julie, who's choosing the colour. It's really interesting actually, because I don't know if anyone here is synesthetic, but if anybody is, then like being synesthetic is bound to be the least interesting thing about you. The three people I worked with on this film, right? There's Julie. She plays the oboe in an orchestra, but she's also campaigning on behalf of shellfish rights. Like, I so nearly bought her a prawn sandwich at Monsters Texas the first day I met her. Thank God I didn't. Right, and then there's Emma, who's she's in a wheelchair because she has a kind of degenerative disease, but she's flown solo around the UK in a light aircraft. She's a journalist, and she has this kind of amazing social life. And Tessa is a stained glass window maker who also runs a small holding in Surrey. It's like, what? When they tell you they're synesthetic, you're like, yeah, whatever. Tell me more about the small holding and the oboe. So the Munsell colour chart, we got them to, played them sounds and got them to choose the exact colour. I mean, the Munsell colour chart is something which is used obviously in scientific circles, but actually the Munsell colour chart does not have every colour, as has been explained to me on many an occasion by a person with synesthesia. Mainly because a lot of the time the colours they see is like a split colour. A lot of them describe it like a shot silk. When you've got the weft goes one way, the warp goes the other, and so it's like two colours instantaneously. So obviously that's not going to be, that's not going to come up on a Juliet's colour chart. The second way, this is Emma, she was interviewing them, so playing them the sound, listening to the sound, and they're describing exactly over and over again, they're describing it, they've chosen the colour, and then they're describing it orally, which I record, and then I play over and over as I'm animating it. And then I also got them to paint or to draw, and that was actually really interesting, because first of all I just took along my toolbox of, my own sort of paints and crayons and stuff, and then I discovered that Tess sees loads of metallics, and so I had to go and get glitter paints and gels and all these different materials, because she had a particular palette. It was really interesting going to visit some of these people in their houses, because you realise that their entire house is decorated in their synesthetic colour palette. So getting them to paint it themselves, and obviously Tessa being an artist, a working artist herself, this was the easiest for her really. So the process then kind of was getting them to, this was Tessa's drawing of painting, of cellophane crumpling. So I had to turn that into something. Now, I'm a 2D animator, I'm a drawn animator, that's my kind of background. But some of the synesthetic responses were very much 3D. So for this film I worked with a 3D animator who kind of consulted came in and did sections. And you'll see it in the film later, but essentially she was very insistent that this was sort of metallic and 3D. Oh, bum it. Oh no, sorry, that wasn't Kate, that was just a painting, sorry. There's one that looks just the same. Okay, so this was, that was Tessa's, and she was, as I said, she was a working artist, so she kind of had loads of experience and was very happy to do drawing and painting. Julie was a musician, she really didn't like doing it. That's probably, that was like weaning, it was like that big, because she was kind of, how people who don't like to draw, really small and in the corner because they don't want to show off. That was her drawing of a light bulb filament popping, when it ends. It was the sound of it. It sort of sizzles and then it pops. You'll see it at the start of the film. But it became more complicated when I took them away from single sounds, because as the film developed, I was working with a sound designer and composer, Adam Goddard, who's a really incredible sound designer in Toronto, and so he was sending me back scraps of the sound, as we were mixing the sound and putting everything together. I would then play them, because very much part of this process was a collaborative process. They would give me, I'd take away these images, then I would take them away, make a digital still of them, send them back to them on a DVD with the sound played over it and say, is this right? And they would say no, inevitably, no, that is not right, it's completely wrong. That yellow's wrong, this is wrong, that text is wrong. And then I would do it again, and eventually we get to the stage where, yeah, okay, that looks a bit more like it, and then I would start to animate it and to move it, and then obviously there'd be issues about how it moved. So it was a kind of really an ongoing conversation, which is why the project took so long. It took 3 years to make the film, just the film, and it was, animation takes a long time, but it doesn't take that long. So then once we'd kind of gone through all that process, I then took mixed sections of the soundtrack to them, and so this was 11 seconds of mixed sound. But of course, when the sound was mixed, there was a different visual reaction. So this is Emma's drawing of how those 11 seconds sounded, and she said, this is really, it became much more complex, became like, a Kandinsky painting, which was a challenge to try and work alongside. Okay, but there were some similarities. I mean, although I've said everybody kind of experiences them differently, there were some similarities, and one of the iconic ones for me was a cockerel crowing, because Julie had said that it was the first time she ever remembered a synesthetic reaction. She said, what's that beautiful sound? And her mum said, it's a cockerel crowing, but she could see it. So I got them all to listen to a cockerel crowing, because I just chose kind of 40 sounds, sort of fairly everyday sounds, not really everyday unless you live in the country, which they all do, because they don't like to be overloaded with too much information. So this is how they responded. So that was all three of their responses, one after the other, and the last one that was animated was Julie's, and the background is quite important here, because they all had very specific backgrounds. In my head, on the screen in my head, because I'm an animator and I have a screen in my head, you kind of think it's all against white or it's all against black, but it wasn't. Julie was mainly a navy blue, midnight blue kind of background, but sometimes she wasn't, it was totally different, it was a beige. Tessa said to me her background was the background of a closed eyelid. You try closing your eyes and drawing that and finding what colour that is, because it depends, what the lighting's like in the room or whatever, and it's a little bit mottled. So they all kind of, the backgrounds are really different. So, this is, oh no, I'm not going to show you this because I'm going to show you the film, but just to say, I have a little video on Vimeo which just is sort of synesthetic reactions to sounds. And the important thing to say about these little clips I'm showing you is that they are documents. They are not for an audience like this, they're for an audience of one, because they only make sense to one person, the person who has that particular type of synesthesia. So I felt that was a really important distinction to make in my sort of documentary practice, that I'm making documents which are, documenting their sort of subjective perspective. And we only got to the end of the process of animating it when they said it was okay, when they said, yes, that's good enough. But the film that I made I would describe as a documentary. So it's a film that's designed to explain or elucidate animation to a kind of broader audience. Okay. Right. Right. So I'm going to skip that one, which is the cell phone in 3D, because I'm running out of time and I'm serious about the train. Right. So this is An Eye Full of Sound. So this is the documentary. It's really important to say, I just wanted to sort of pick up on the conversation that Michelle was having about the kind of power relationship between the scientists and the artists. This is a welcome trust. And I feel that absolutely that's the case. Quite often there is a kind of like power relationship where you feel a bit like you're being asked to kind of like provide information about the subject. But I think it's really important that as artists we don't just do that. That it's not just informative, it's transformative, which I started from that guy's name, I can't remember. But it is transformative, you're taking it and you're doing something else with it. And so I just like to draw your attention, in this, Adam and I, the sound designer, we deliberately kind of cut the voices almost at a tangent sometimes to what Jamie, the researcher and the kind of like world-leading expert in synesthesia says. There's a point where, they disagree with him, where they kind of talk across him. And there's a part where he's really wistful and talks about how much he'd like to have synesthesia, because like me, he doesn't have it. And we just sit in awe and watch people and say, why can't I see those lovely things? So, this is the film.
From the top, it's just...
It's sort of like, I can't think of the right word.
It starts like that.
That's the beginning bit.
I'd like to get a little bit of...
Almost like a...
It's not like... It's like the...
Almost, only much thicker than that, but it's still not. And these go up. It goes
Well, no, it's not. It's
down
going
and up again.
my right to my left. It's sort of like...
It's doing that. Something like
But
that.
I'm hearing something different.
It's sort of to there.
There's more than one colour there, more than one sound. I like muted sounds, that kind of thing. People walking, not clippity high heels, because that's not muted, but softer shoes. That's the kind of sound I like very much. I feel it in my mouth and I taste it. It's lovely.
All sounds have colour. The alphabet has colour.
You know, words and numbers and things like
Days
that.
of the week have colour. And each day has a colour and a certain shape.
Hearing colours, seeing sound, tasting smells, tasting and feeling sounds and colours.
All sounds have colour.
People walking, not clippity high heels.
To be honest, I see things very flowingly, really, really flowingly within my head. Very flowingly and forward moving and really hard to describe.
When I see things, I'm not quite sure whether I'm seeing or hearing them.
Very swirly rather than static.
And I see things in the road that aren't there.
I see it within my body.
That's because I've heard something.
Hard to describe. All around my body and within my head. I just thought it was very normal. That's how it's always been, sort of thing, you know.
I was made much more aware of this when I heard an orchestra playing.
Music is really, really stimulating.
Oh, I think so.
So much fun.
And I didn't realise it was individual instruments. I thought there was some sort of coloured quilt. I couldn't quite make out what was going on.
Everything's very smooth and like chocolate, waves of chocolate.
I see it in my body coming right up and out.
Well, I just saw this most glorious series of colours.
Rich, purpley pink.
And they went up and then they came down again, and oh, it was just lovely. And I said, what is that?
Oh, there's no question about it. All sounds have colour. The alphabet has colour. Days of the week have colour. And each day has a colour and a certain shape.
Hearing colours, seeing sound, tasting smells, tasting and feeling sounds and colours. But I sometimes think that these colours don't really exist outside our heads. I wonder if they do.
So synesthesia is a fascinating condition where people experience the ordinary world in very extraordinary ways.
I can't imagine what it's like without it.
It's often described as a mixing of the senses, so these people have like an extra sensation. So when they listen to music, they might experience coloured blobs appearing and moving and swirling.
If you haven't got synesthesia, I don't know how you would see classical music, but I imagine everybody sees it as being very flowing.
Or when they're listening to me speaking, their tongue might fill with different tastes and kind of an ebb and flow. So we think of it as an extra sensation, but to them it just feels completely normal, and it feels like our experiences have something absent from them. They don't necessarily think of it as being adverse. They get used to the sensations being there, and to some extent they can filter them out.
In everyday life, I tune it out.
It's a lot more common than you think, and we now think it's a few percent of the population. So if you know, for example, 150 people, there's at least 6 or 7 people with synesthesia, but often you don't know who they are or so on, unless you go and ask all your acquaintances whether they have it.
It's like saying, when do you first remember having hair? You know, it's just always, that's how it's always been, sort of thing, you know.
Nobody's found the synesthesia gene yet, but you can show with biology that there are a genetic component.
My mother, my brother, my mother's mother, my son, and I think my granddaughter is.
People are collecting DNA samples. You can do that by rubbing the inside of the cheek, and little cells come off and you analyse that. And people have shown that there is a genetic contribution to that.
Oh yes, lots of people.
We've looked actually in the brains of synesthetes. So with scanners, for example, you can people lie down, they listen to music, and you can see what's happening in their brain. So some of the people with coloured music, the parts of the brain to do with vision are activated. If I was to have synesthesia, I think I would have the coloured music variety.
It's a really nice one, isn't it?
They don't just experience colours with music, they experience shapes and movements and textures, and they're all, you know, appearing and disappearing. To actually experience it that way, I think would be wonderful.
It's wonderful, I think.
Yes, yes. This is the sound that starts, which is a silvery sound.
Oh, you're getting me all excited.
And then out of it come 3 little red holly berries. Getting smaller, moving to the left.
And it's very much on my left-hand side.
And then in between, there's sort of black and green.
Oh, green. White.
Almost black. There's a little bit of green.
And it's got lots of sort of dancing sort of lights around it. It is like a rich dark green, this round bit.
And then there's the yellow.
Those little dots, they were yellow. Quite a strong yellow.
Yellow.
So it fills the whole of my brain. Oh, yeah.
They make my brain go, lots of little rods of yellow in this one.
The yellow ochre. And then a bright yellow.
Yellows and whites, zigzaggy lights.
Oh, and the tiny little silver bits.
Yes, the silver is nice.
It's really moving sound.
Tiny little silver balls. Sparkly ones, see-through ones.
Lots of silver.
Textured little bubbly bits.
Left to right.
Right to left.
Thrashing out. Lots of silver.
They jiggle and wriggle like electricity, like a whole load of electricity.
It's all vibration.
And they're all vibrating in each other.
And I feel the vibration in my body.
There's a lot going on.
The noise in between looks like cloth to me.
It looks like a piece of sugar paper.
No, it's a weave cheesecloth of sound.
Well, it's spherical.
not actually.
Going round.
It's not perfectly round like a sphere.
Well,
Hands
it's not
scrunching up.
flat.
No, it's not like a shape. It's like the movement.
Well, yes.
It's like, but they are quite. You know how if you imagine.
It's as if someone with squeaky shoes is walking down a darkish passage.
Yeah.
Something like
It's so
that, yeah.
hard to describe
I
it.
just need a huge brush and a big lot of white and silver.
I like that because that's quite rich.
Yes.
It's a really moving sound.
There's a lot going on.
Yes, it's too much. Good, well, look, we better not go on.
Hearing colours, seeing sounds, tasting smells, tasting and feeling sounds and colours.
I can never really get away from it, but I do like silence.
So the credits on for waiting. So yes, that's the film, and hopefully that kind of encapsulates the people who I worked with on it. Felt like it did encapsulate something. One of them said that their husband felt that, after however many years they've been married, felt that he understood what synesthesia was after having seen it. She's very articulate, so I was surprised that, sort of trying to convey something. I'd just like to say thank you to Alice and Michelle and Heather for hosting and co-talking. And can I just say that the Open City Docs, did I say it right? Open City Docs Fest is on the 22nd of June at UCL, and there's a strand talking about science and, is it science and film or science and arts? Science and film. Yeah, so, I'll be there talking with my colleague Ellie Land about the project we're currently doing called Silent Signal, which is working with microbiologists and various different exciting cutting-edge research scientists about the project that we're doing at the moment. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Have you got time for a couple of questions?
Yeah, I do. I'm sorry, I was just kind of wrapping it up in a wrappy-uppy kind of way.
And I can, if you send me the link, I'll forward.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Any questions?
Just one really quick one. In the film, there was a little white box in the center of the film.
Oh, yeah.
Every now and then.
Yeah.
What was?
Well, okay, so it was one of those things where I think I just crawled up my own bum too far. But basically, the idea was, that the film was divided into 3 sections, and all of these people all had very strong forms of synesthesia. I noticed they all lived in the country. None of them lived in the city. They said if they went to a shop that was playing music, they had to walk out because they found it too distracting visually, trying to look at clothes, and they're finding, things all over the place. So my idea was that it was somebody going from the country to the city on the train. So that was actually no smoking sign. For the first third of the film, all the action's going that way, because we're going that way, okay? And then when we get there, we go to Jamie's office and the whole action takes place on the whiteboard, and that's the kind of sciencey bit where he's kind of explaining and being slightly undercut by them, butting in. And then the way home, it's dark. And so we're going the other direction, so it still has the white thing on. But when you kind of look out the dark train window and you can see your face, then you can see other things as well. It's like really kind of, through windows and stuff. So that was it, but I probably was being a bit wanky to do this. Yeah, it kind of was a thing. Yeah.
When you did the cockerel, and there was a drawing.
Yes.
The coloured one, there was one that had maybe a bit of colour, but it was mainly black and white.
Yes.
And it was curving over.
Yeah.
I mean, I sort of really got, I really felt that was right.
Yes.
I sort of felt that is the right one.
Yeah.
And it was quite weird because it was quite definite, and I always liked it better than the other ones, which were colour. But that one, I thought I quite liked to copy that.
Yeah.
Because it was like so. I was so certain. If somebody told me that was a different sound, like move. Hey mate, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Because you really feel it, don't you?
It's so much. Well, it's really interesting because the 2-year project that we did like a research and development project before we made the film, and that was kind of much more about my service to kind of Jamie and helping him kind of illustrating ideas that he had. But one of the things that we did was we took some musical notes, and I animated the correct synesthetic response according to the group of synesthetes who we worked with. And then we interviewed some non-synesthetic people, and we said, can you try and kind of imagine what the view would go, what you would sort of visualise to go with that sound. And then I animated that in the same way. And then at the Science Museum, in the live science bit, we tested it out on 300 people to see which ones they prefer. Overwhelmingly, people prefer the synesthetic reactions to the non-synesthetic reactions. And recent research shows that actually, Jules Simner at Edinburgh argues that actually it's a continuum. It's thought that people are either synesthetic or non-synesthetic, but she argues that it's actually, because you think about the way language works, metaphor and simile, we have to have an understanding. You talk about sounds being sharp, that doesn't make sense, you don't taste a sound. But there are kind of understandings, so I think what you say is really interesting, because I think we do, I really hope that we do. I like to think I've got synesthesia by osmosis, by talking about it for so long, it's kind of just sunk into my bones. But yeah, you just kind of, you feel some things are right, and you really understand why they're right. But you probably wouldn't, you wouldn't necessarily come up with that image yourself.
That's one more question. When you've got a projective synesthesia, I think I had one student who had numbers, and she said she got colours glowing around the number.
Yeah.
And I didn't do this, I wish I'd done it. But it'd be quite nice to get if she saw a number, say, I don't know, 3, and they say it was green, it'd be quite nice to take some blue paper
Yeah.
or get some paper that was maybe changing colour in the middle and see if she matched up the colour, because she actually projects on the page, to see if she matched, say, if you got her to match a colour with it, and see if she matched it wrongly, because she was actually misreading the colour of the paper, because she was actually like a transfer.
Well, it's interesting, when we use the muzzle colour chart, none of the colours are numbered, they're just on pages, and they do have numbers, but they're not visible when you choose the colours. And it was so interesting because we would retest them, and every time they would choose exactly the same shade of emerald green, and a whole page of emerald greens. It would always be the same one every time, that specific shade, because that was the only one that felt right, that was the only one that looked right. It's like, what colour socks are you wearing? You don't change the colour, you look down and you say that's the colour, it's not going to be blue because today it's red. So it's kind of, it's that sort of like fundamental and unchanging. Cool.
Last question?
I have a question. Were any of them tested for colour blindness?
No, they weren't. I didn't think so. No. Why? What was?
Well, it kind of disproved my theory halfway through, because and I don't know whether you just did it aesthetically, because then suddenly I thought there was nothing was green, and in your earlier slide nothing was green. But then just I was thinking that went bam,
green.
But I thought there wasn't so many red. I didn't know if red was just green.
There are colours that come up again and again. Dr. Eagman has got a synesthesia battery. He works in the state. You can go online. You can just Google synesthesia battery. They spell it differently because they're American. It's got no A in it. But if you look at that, you can do a test, and he's like got thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are proclaimed synesthetic. And there are some colours that come up more and more, like A and E are more likely to be red, O is more likely to be white. There is, but they're not. You couldn't sort of say, right, this is the synesthetic alphabet. But there are some similarities about colours that keep you colour. Yeah, it's really interesting.
It's not a question, but I was intrigued to hear that you and your colleague felt that you were missing out on something by not having it. My gut reaction was, I'm so glad I don't have it. I hated parts of it. I love your animation. But I was feeling quite uncomfortable. I had to look down.
Okay, because it was
so glad I don't
overwhelming.
have it.
Yeah, actually, someone came up to me at the synesthesia conference and said, "Oh, you're so creative." And I said, "Well, you've got synesthesia, and you're so lucky." And they said, "No, because I can't ever choose the reactions I have to anything. Whereas as a creative, you can choose. Do I want this to be blue, or do I feel like it would be better red? But they haven't got a choice. It has to be a very specific colour, texture, movement, whatever. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah,
you can't switch it off.
No, exactly. Yeah, and tone it down.
There's a very strong Isle green smell coming from the back of the room as well. Maybe think of that mix between kind of smell and
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We will end Alice, Michelle and Sam, thank you for coming. We're not rushing off, so if you want to stay around and chat to whoever for a few minutes, that's fine. Next fundraiser is 17th of June and booking is open from Cantalis and I mentioned earlier.